Hello, everybody. So we are officially going to be starting to read the Canterbury Tales. We are going to start off with the prologue. There are a few different sections of the Canterbury Tales, but we are going to do a modified version of the prologue as our first reading. But there are a lot of different characters in the Canterbury Tales. So I wanted to go over this presentation with you guys to try and organize the characters a little bit and make sure you know the details associated with each character. If you are a core student or an online student doing this, you should be filling out the note sheet that is provided on Canvas that associates with this presentation. If you are an in-person hybrid student, you will be taking half of your notes in class and then the other half at home. So you can do those on either a line sheet of paper or you can do them on the Google Doc that I provide. You can either take them digitally or you can print them out yourself and take them using a pen or pencil and then uploading a picture of the notes when they are due. So please make sure you know to fill out the notes along with this presentation because the notes are a good chunk of points that will help your overall grade once I enter those points into the grade book. So I'm going to go ahead and get started here. So the prologue, like I said, is going to be the first part that you're going to be reading for the story. And that first bullet point says, in spring, raining to end the drought of March, water brings life to plants, flowers, wind blows on the new shoots, birds are singing near the middle of April. So this is kind of setting up our scene for the prologue. It says, people going on pilgrimages to see remnants of saints going toward Canterbury in hopes that Becket will cure them when they are sick. So these people are pilgrims going on a pilgrimage to Canterbury. There are 29 pilgrims to be exact, and a lot of these people fit into different categories, which is again why we're reviewing each one of the characters. And they are staying at the Tabard Inn. So I want you to think for a moment of why it's significant that this takes place in springtime. What is the significance that you can usually associate with spring, whether that's giving way to new life, winter turning to warm? Think about a few different things of why springtime could be significant and why they decided to make that the setting for the prologue. So this kind of breaks down each one of the pilgrims into a chart here. We will be going over a majority of these and giving you characteristics on each one of these characters to make sure that you're familiar with who they are and their significance as well. So some potential topics to consider, there's a reason why there's a question mark afterwards is because these are all topics that you can consider, but these don't have to be all of the topics that are covered within the Canterbury Tales. I'm sure there's a lot of other topics that you can consider when we do our reading, but these are just some ones that you could potentially correlate the story to or think about when you're reading the story. So the first one is women, relationships, marriage, religion, sins, virtues, philosophies of above, and satire, a word that you should be familiar with now, and the purpose of satire and also examples of satire too. So something that we will be focusing on is the correlation of the characters with the 7 deadly sins and their corresponding virtues. So again, this story was written in the Middle Ages, and it is supposed to take place in the Middle Ages. So the 7 deadly sins and their corresponding virtues were of high importance at this time, especially the virtues. If you were a virtuous person, you were considered to be high in society. Most of the times, people who were in a knight status had to have high virtues and maintain this abstinence of any sin in their life. So the first sin that is represented is lust, and then its virtue that corresponds with lust is chastity or abstinence. The second one is gluttony, and then the virtue that corresponds with that is temperance. Third one is greed. Corresponding virtue is charity or generosity. Fourth one is sloth, and its corresponding virtue is diligence. Then we have wrath and patience, envy, kindness and appreciation. And then our last one there is pride, and its corresponding virtue is humility. So we're going to see which characters portray not only the sins, but also the virtues as well. So there's a lot of representation of these sins and virtues throughout each one of the characters in the Canterbury Tales. So again, it's something important to consider as we read the prologue and read a few other of the tales. So the knight is supposed to have the most virtue or maintain the most virtue. A potential sin, though, could be pride or maybe vain, but majority of the time the knight is seen as being this very virtuous person who has humility, diligence, and then maybe implements some elements of satire as well, as we see some situational irony that happens. For example, we don't expect a knight to be underdressed for a pilgrimage, but he seems to be underdressed in this story. So some things to consider as we look at the knight, and also consider these things when we look at other characters as well. What sin could they represent? What virtue could they represent? And what element of satire could they represent as well? So we have the knight here. He loves truth, freedom, chivalry, honor, and he's supposed to be very distinguished. He's always victorious, wears very plain clothing, which again is potentially that element of satire. Why is a knight who's seen as very high in society wearing such plain dress? And he is going to Canterbury to thank the saints for preserving his life through the battles. He is the most respected character of the Canterbury Tales, and he is seen as completely virtuous. You could potentially attach this element of vanity to the knight maybe, but because he is so plain in dress, it kind of takes away that potential of him being vain. But again, we do see this, him being plain in dress, as potentially satirical because he is high in society, and he is very respected, and he is able to dress in very vain clothing, but he decides to dress very plainly. So this is the knight. Again, he is completely virtuous, doesn't really represent any sins. You could potentially make the argument for vanity, but like I mentioned before, he shows up to Canterbury very plain in his dress. And then we have the squire. The squire is the knight's son. He's supposed to be a bit younger. Now he is a ladies' man, though. He is described as having curly hair, strong. He sings, plays the flute, stays out all night. Very lighthearted and kind and pleasant to be around. But he can be seen as proud and lustful. And the one piece down at the bottom there, but of average height, he is perceived as being very strong and agile, but during this time period, height was something that was considered amongst warriors and knights, and also something that women considered in terms of choosing a man. So he, again, it can be seen as proud and lustful. He is that ladies' man. So these are potential sins that he could demonstrate throughout the Canterbury Tales. Then we have the yeoman. He's the servant to the knight and the squire. He's an outdoorsman, very talented wood carver, carries a bow, a shield, a sword. He is very good with the bow. However, he is a bit ostentatious, which essentially means just proud, and potentially envious because he is the servant to the knight and the squire as well. So potential sin that he could demonstrate is the fact that he is a bit proud, and you could make the argument that he is maybe a little envious of the knight and the squire. And then we have the nun, or you could also reference her as the prioress. She spoke French not very well, eats in a very refined manner. However, the irony about her is that she swore constantly. Not like the typical swear words that you hear nowadays, but she would say, by Saint Loy, a saint known for not swearing, which is very ironic. So potential irony that she could portray during the story in her swearing. She was also very vain and very concerned with her outward appearances. And she had animals with her. She had 3 dogs, and she cares a lot more for them than she does for the humans. Although she is very vain and concerned with her outward appearance, she physically, it says that she has a big forehead, which during this time period was a sign of intelligence. And she also carried around a coral trinket and rosary. The coral trinket is supposed to fight away worldly temptations. But again, she does portray a few different ironic elements. The fact that she's very concerned with outward appearances and could potentially be considered as vain. The fact that she's swearing all the time. So this is the nun. She is seen as very high in society, though. So keep that in mind as we continue reading through the prologue for the Canterbury Tales. So then we have a nun and three priests. I apologize there because my bottom of my slide is kind of cut off. Now, this was the nun on the previous slide, Madame Eglantin. I can never pronounce that correctly, so I apologize if I completely butchered that. But we'll just call her Madame E. And the nun and 3 priests were Madame E's fan club. The nun was Madame E's secretary. So although Madame E is the nun, we will refer to her as Madame E. And then the nun and 3 priests we will refer to as a nun and 3 priests. So hopefully that doesn't get too confusing because I know there are 2 nuns. But the nun and 3 priests were, again, Madame E's kind of fan club. And the nun was Madame E's secretary. They do demonstrate quite a few different sins throughout the story here. We have gluttony, pride, envious, lustful, swearing, avarice. There's all sorts of things that they could portray in terms of the sin realm. And this also goes along with Madame E as well. So Madame E, the nun, and 3 priests portray a lot of potential different sins throughout the story, which is supposed to be satirical and supposed to be funny. Or funny in a different kind of sense, I guess. But the reason that they do portray these types of sins in comparison with the virtues is because they are trying to create a satirical element to the story. Last one I will review for this part is the monk. The monk loved hunting, fine foods. He had many hunting dogs, was dressed in very fine clothes. He was rather fat, very jolly, and bald-headed. So therefore he portrays the potential sin of gluttony. He did love food. It'll be mentioned multiple times throughout the prologue. He loves food. His favorite food was roasted swan. He most of the time ignored the rules of the monastery, and everything he does is in violation of the vows that he made to the monastery. So he again is seen as portraying these sins of gluttony, potentially pride, definitely sloth, which again, he's not diligent in his efforts towards the monastery, and potentially lust as well. You can definitely see the gluttony and the sloth, though, during the reading of the prologue. So this is all that I'm going to do for part 1. I am going to make a part 2 and a part 3. So I'm trying to keep these videos underneath 15 minutes because I don't want to entirely bore you to that point. So I apologize. Again, make sure you're taking notes on either the note sheet that I provided on Canvas or on your own sheet of paper.